Hi, welcome to the bathtub, where when you hear this sound effect, or you hear this theme song, and you see no whiteboard, you know we're in the new pre-tech. We're doing a whole new pre-tech. No CGI anymore. We're not doing all the the overproduction, the ridiculous production costs of the previous bathtubs. We're cutting back, more pared back, primitive. It's almost a pre-industrial version of the bathtub. It's kind of like when we first started doing the show back in the probably the 30s, 20s and 30s. Fred Allen and I used to do this. We did it with like two orange, those frozen orange can containers. We have a string and two frozen orange can containers. Sometimes we didn't even take the orange juice out of the containers, and we used those and we talked to each other through those. We're going back to that kind of purity, the purity of expression that we have with pre-tech. So we fired the production department, and they're just weeping at home. They have nothing to do, complaining to their mothers, and we don't need any high tech to bring out the great beauty of good books. So we're cutting it back basically because I get tired of having to erase stuff, and some Brazilian company tells me that they have the rights to some song I stole off the YouTube, so I'm not doing that anymore. Anyway, we're talking about Harry Crews. This is part 2. About a few days ago, we got these lovely new editions from Penguin. I don't really do books from new editions, but this was quite a cool set. It's the A Childhood. He's probably in some ways got his best press during his lifetime. Was his autobiography, a really, really powerful and disturbing and upsetting book about his childhood growing up in Georgia and Florida as a boy, where everyone he saw had some sort of, they were missing eyeballs or had arms missing or fingers or huge scars from living in these really, really tough, poor conditions. And Harry Crews writes very beautifully about them in this book. But they also, with that, they published his first novel. They republished The Gospel Singer. Almost all of Harry Crews' novels, as we said last week, are hard to get. And there are many of his books that are very well known, that did very well. The Gospel Singer has good reviews. There's a good quote by Carl Hyacin says it's funny, and Carl Hyacin is funny. It did well, I guess, when it came out, and as I understood, Harry Crews that's how he went to Gainesville. He became a professor after that, and had a pretty decent career teaching. But it's been a hard book to find. You never really see this anywhere. I don't think I ever saw another edition of this in a bookshop in all my years of haunting bookstores. The books that are kind of, when we talked about Harry Crews last week, we kind of stirred up a hornet's nest of Harry Crews aficionados, people who just suddenly, wrote me about how much they loved Harry Crews. And there were certain books of his they loved, and books like Car came up a lot, and Karate is a Thing of the Spirit, which I have not read, came up a lot. And the one I remember vividly is A Feast of Snakes, a really dark, funny, very funny black comedy, which I read that. That's from the early 70s as well. Those were all pretty well known. So I was a little surprised when Penguin chose this as the one of the two books they brought out together. It has an introduction here by Kevin Wilson. And they were right. It's a really good book. I read it in like 2-3 days. I couldn't put it down. It's a beautifully written book. It's easier. I find his fiction, which is nightmarish. All his fiction is nightmarish. But they're funny, and they're not as disturbing as some of the stuff in the autobiography. He kind of turns it into this huge world. He creates this kind of nightmarish world of the rural Georgia. And in this one particularly, it's populated by religious crooks. It's very, very similar. The whole time I was reading it, reminded me so much of Flannery O'Connor. It sent me back to rereading one of my all-time favorite writers, Flannery O'Connor, particularly Wise Blood. This one has a guy named the Gospel Singer. He's like a local character from a town called Enigma. Enigma. And they also call it, in their vernacular, they call it Enigma. And it's the city, which is filled with, again, just the people who he writes about. People are very poor. People live in these houses they pretty much built themselves. People have no real technology in this town, and no very little running water or electricity. But they spend all their time going to the church. And the Gospel Singer has this great voice, and he's a really handsome young guy who started off as a just a normal kid, but he found out he had this golden voice, and so he goes on the revival circuit. And he goes on the revival circuit, and all these people book him into hotels and into big shows at big arenas and churches so that he can bring in money, basically. And all these people start to come. He's like an Elvis, a religious Elvis. It's very funny book. It has, again, as far as a nightmarish landscape, so you have the religious crooks, and then the religious crooks are followed by a group of people who are run by a guy named the Foot. They're called have a freak fair. So they're basically people who have deformities, and really the Foot is who's the head of this freak fair, is basically a small man with a gigantic foot. And he's very intelligent. He knows what he's doing, but he gets all these different people. For example, he has a guy they hire who eats chickens alive. It's a disgusting thing, but they don't really show it in the book. But it's just the idea is pretty horrific. And people with horns growing out of them, and people who are very deformed in kind of horrific ways. And they basically, the Foot has learned that if he follows the gospel singer, after people go to the revival and feel like they're religious and they've been reformed and they've been saved, they can go to the freak fair and make fun of all these horrible deformities. It's a very fun. It sounds not very funny, but it is very funny, and very funny in the way that Flannery O'Connor is funny. I'd read a little short passage, just a very short passage. There's so many weird characters in this book, and one of them is a guy named Didymus. I don't know where he gets the name Didymus, but Didymus is basically a religious zealot. He's a guy who likes to punish himself, and he wants to. He takes over the gospel singer. He actually kills the gospel singer's manager and then takes over his professional representation, and constantly is following the gospel singer around and taking him to his shows and so forth. And the gospel singer is totally unreligious. He doesn't believe in God. He doesn't believe in the church. All he wants to do is go to each show and have sex with one girl at the show. That's all he thinks about. It's just sex. And Didymus starts to make him pay penance. Every time he has sex, he has to pay penance. So it's this weird balance of hypocrisies, throughout this really, really poor, crazy culture. I'll give a quick picture of Didymus and his childhood, which was pretty awful. It's page 59. He had known for a long time that suffering was the true path to holiness. He had learned it slowly but well during the first 10 years of his life, the 10 years it had taken his father to beat his mother to death. It was in his 10th year that his mother had hemorrhaged after a beating and died calling to her God and blessing her husband, who stood above her with a 2-ply razor strap, refusing to go for a doctor. That afternoon his father had run amuck with a knife in the dock in San Francisco, California, where he worked as a header and gutter of fish, and in his frenzy had fallen into the sea and drowned, while the man he had been trying to kill with a knife cursed and tried to stab him with a gaffing hook. This kind of just uncontrollable, random, horrible violence is constantly going on in the background or in the center of all these Harry Crews books. Didymus went to an orphanage. He was not an attractive boy, small and dark, with an intensity about him that at first frightened the other boys and then angered them. He prayed as his mother had taught him, quietly absorbing the punishment of his fellows by day and piercing his skin with needles by night, in an ecstasy of revulsion, because he had been taught by his mother that it was only by denying the flesh and triumphing over it that he would finally be received into the kingdom of heaven. When he slept, his mother's spirit, from its place at the right hand of God, approved his self-mutilation and called him prophet. So he's the guy who thinks he's a prophet. He's working on everything. Everyone's trying to use the gospel singer to advance their own cause, and all the gospel singer really wants is to get laid at the next presentation. It's a dark, funny, hilarious book. There's also in the middle of it a murder. A black friend of the gospel singer when he was young is in prison for killing a white girl, and so there's a whole lynching thing going on in the background, and the crazy. Basically, it's the population looking for ways of releasing all their anger and craziness, and it's a comedy. That's the weird part. It's very similar. In fact, it sent me straight to Wise Blood, I'm reading it now. I'm going to talk about that in just a few days. Wise Blood is one of Flannery O'Connor's greatest pieces of fiction, and it's very similar. It set me right to this. The other person he slightly reminds me of is Chester Himes. I mean, it's set in a place that he knows. So Harry Crews uses Georgia and these rural backwoods type people and towns and cities, and he uses the places he knows, but at the same time he turns them into a really kind of a Boschian landscape, a real fantastic landscape. It's just almost like a dark horror story. And that's very similar to these amazing books by Chester Himes. I always love the Harlem Cycle, A Rage in Harlem. If you ever want to start, we're going to talk about Chester Himes soon, but it reminds me quite a bit of that kind of take, the use of your own material in the world, and to create it into this wider, weirder, stranger landscape. I find it much easier to read than the childhood, but it's dark, funny stuff. Okay, take care. More soon. No tech, low tech, or mini tech. We're not going to do much tech.